The sun rose pale and distant over the jagged cliffs of Okinawa. Colonel Hideo Nakamura, 48, stood inside his reinforced command bunker, squinting at the distant horizon through a slit in the concrete. He had spent years fortifying this ridge overlooking the eastern beaches, 6 massive pillboxes, interconnected trenches, and fields of barbed wire designed to make any landing an unmitigated nightmare. Intelligence reports had warned him that the Americans were advancing with overwhelming firepower, but nothing had prepared him for what came next. Below the ridge, waves of U.S. Navy destroyers and LSTs converged, the sound of naval bombardment shaking the earth. Nakamura's men, hardened veterans of the Pacific Campaign, clutched Type 99 rifles and machine guns, their faces pale beneath their helmets. They had faced flamethrowers, artillery barrages, and airstrikes before. What terrified them most was the invincibility of the bunkers themselves. Reinforced concrete walls, up to 3 feet thick, had repelled everything thrown at them until April 1st, when American engineers began unloading an unfamiliar weapon. A lieutenant approached Nakamura, his voice tight with worry. "Colonel, they call it the bazooka. They say one of their men claims it can pierce armor from over 100 yards. Nakamura laughed softly, a dry sound. He had seen reports of American anti-tank weapons, the infamous M1S and M1A1S, but those were for vehicles, not for bunkers. And yet, the weapon's simplicity unnerved him. The Americans were methodical. Soldiers in olive-drab uniforms advanced cautiously along the coral ridges, 2-man teams carrying the new tubes across exposed terrain. Nakamura's scouts reported every movement. Each time the teams appeared, Nakamura's instinct was to target them with his machine guns. But the weapon's unusual shape and unpredictable trajectory made aiming difficult. The Americans moved quickly, firing in short, precise bursts. He could see the rockets arcing through the air, each trailing a thin plume of smoke. When the first shot struck, it was almost imperceptible at first. A dull clang echoed inside the bunker. Nakamura rushed to the slit, expecting his men to have misjudged the strike. But then a fissure appeared in the reinforced wall, tiny at first, spider-webbing outward with each successive impact. The bunker had been built to withstand mortars and heavy artillery. Now, from 120 yards, this improvised tube weapon was creating breaches. His men stared in disbelief. Their confidence wavered. The engineers and gunners coordinating the bazooka teams adjusted sights carefully, leading their fire across the narrow angles of the pillboxes. One rocket struck a ventilation slit, another landed against the rear wall. A cascade of sparks, smoke, and dust erupted. Within minutes, sections of the fortifications crumbled under hits that should have been impossible. Nakamura's jaw tightened. He had spent years perfecting these defenses. And now, from a distance that should have been safe, his men were suddenly vulnerable. The psychological impact hit first. Soldiers whispered among themselves, glancing nervously at one another. A weapon that could destroy a concrete bunker with minimal training, minimal preparation, and from a range that kept operators just outside his rifle's effective reach that was new. That was terrifying. Nakamura realized that the old doctrines, the walls, the entrenchments, the fortified firing positions were suddenly irrelevant. The Americans were not just attacking, they were rewriting the rules of engagement with a single, portable weapon. By mid-morning, the first wave of bunkers had partially collapsed. Nakamura's orders became frantic, defensive fire overlapping with desperate counterattacks. But every time a team advanced, the bazookas followed. The weapon was simple, effective, and fast. Soldiers could reload in seconds, adjust angles on the fly, and fire, repeatedly at reinforced positions. The ridge Nakamura had believed impregnable was now vulnerable to every well-trained soldier armed with this unassuming tube. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine defensive expectations across the Pacific. What had once been thought invincible was proving to be fragile against ingenuity and determination. Nakamura, now pale beneath his sweat, understood that the next few hours would decide not just the ridge, but potentially his own life and that of every soldier under his command. Before we jump back in, Tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. November 8th, 1942. The sun rose pale and hesitant over the Mediterranean, casting long, cool shadows across the beaches of Oruran and Casablanca. American and British forces were finally landing, their boats cutting through the choppy waters, each hull carrying soldiers who had trained for years, or in some cases, hours preparing for this moment. Among them were units equipped with a weapon few had ever seen, the M1 bazooka. For most infantrymen, the crates of metal tubes and rockets were more mysterious than reassuring. Opened only moments before disembarking, the bazookas came with no instructions, no instructors, just a promise that this small 5-foot tube could somehow make a difference against the mechanized forces of Europe and Africa. Many soldiers stared skeptically, weighing the practicality of pointing a 50-pound tube at armored monsters they had only glimpsed in photographs. The Japanese, or rather, in this campaign, French colonial forces aligned with Vichy were not armoured like the Germans, but their bunkers and fortified positions posed an equally terrifying problem. Thick stone walls, steel-reinforced embrasures, and deep dugouts meant that advancing infantry faced the impossible choice of charging blindly or finding another way to breach the defences. That other way was the bazooka, a weapon designed originally for tanks, but versatile enough for these stubborn fortifications. Colonel Satoru Hoshino, commanding a defensive sector near Oruran, had grown confident in the impregnability of his bunkers. He had overseen the construction of reinforced positions along the ridges, stocked with ammunition, machine guns, and rifles. He had watched Allied landings on the horizon for weeks, and was sure nothing as rudimentary as a shoulder-fired rocket could pose a real threat from 120 yards. The thought of 2 men standing in open sand, hurling explosives at his lines, struck him as laughable. But the first bazooka teams advanced. Soldiers of the 34th Infantry Division moved cautiously, using small dunes and ridges as cover. Teams of 2 gunner and loader carried their rockets forward, eyes scanning for targets. The M1 launcher, with its improvised wooden stock and 2.36-inch warhead, was simple to operate. Sight, aim, squeeze. No recoil, no fancy calculations, just the hope that the warhead would strike true. The first shots flew, rockets hissed through the air, surprising in their smooth flight. Hoshino's soldiers ducked instinctively as the projectiles struck stone walls with explosive precision. One bunker, which had been considered impenetrable, erupted from the impact, sending smoke and debris into the morning air. Others followed, carefully aimed at loopholes, gun ports, and ventilation shafts. From 120 yards away, American soldiers were suddenly reshaping the battlefield. What Hoshino had assumed was invulnerable now trembled under the pressure of this unexpected weapon. The psychological shock was immediate. Men inside the bunkers scrambled, unsure of where the next rocket might strike. The noise, the smoke, the sudden destruction. It was a glimpse of a new kind of warfare, one where an infantryman could reach across the distance and threaten what had once seemed untouchable. The bazooka was no miracle. Early models misfired, rockets burned incompletely, and operators were forced to move dangerously close to ensure hits. Yet, even with its flaws, the weapon gave the Americans a fighting chance. Where grenades and small arms had failed, the bazooka pierced concrete, steel, and the confidence of those who thought themselves secure. Colonel Hoshino realized, with a rare pang of unease, that he had underestimated the Americans. A simple, crude tube, the kind one might dismiss as a toy, was now cracking his defenses, forcing him to reconsider tactics he had relied upon for years. The era of invulnerable bunkers, it seemed, was ending. By the close of the first day, the Americans had secured several key positions, and the bazooka's reputation began to spread among troops and commanders alike. What started as improvisation on the testing grounds of Maryland had now become a tool of practical, terrifying effect on the beaches of North Africa. Hoshino would remember that day not for the courage of his men, but for the audacity of a weapon that could strike from 120 yards and change the very rules of defense. November 9th, 1942. The aftermath of the initial landings left a scorched and chaotic landscape along the beaches of Oruran. American troops had advanced inland, leaving behind overturned vehicles, shattered bunkers, and the faint acrid smell of spent rockets. But the real story wasn't just in the destruction, it was in how quickly both sides began adapting to a weapon that was rewriting the rules of combat. Colonel Satoru Hoshino convened an emergency meeting with his company commanders. For the first time, the bunker layouts he had so carefully constructed seemed vulnerable. "These Americans," he said grimly, "have a weapon that reaches beyond our walls. We must think differently, or we will lose more than territory, we will lose morale." Officers took notes, sketching new defensive patterns, moving machine guns to unexpected angles, and reinforcing blind spots that had been previously considered safe. Yet, even their swiftest adaptations could not entirely negate the threat posed by the M1 bazooka. Meanwhile, American troops were learning their own lessons. Private James McAllister, a bazooka operator from the 34th Infantry, discovered the delicate balance between distance and accuracy. Rockets fired too far would drift harmlessly, but getting too close exposed the gunner to enemy fire. He and his loader, Corporal Thomas Reynolds, practiced silently behind dunes, testing different stances, firing angles, and approaches to maximize effect while minimizing risk. Every misfire became a lesson, every successful strike a boost to confidence. In the field, improvisation became essential. Bazooka teams coordinated with riflemen and mortarmen, combining suppressive fire with targeted rocket strikes. A single bunker might be assaulted from 3 sides: a machine gun to pin defenders, riflemen to force movement, and a bazooka rocket to finish what bullets could not. Soldiers learned to read the enemy's pattern, to anticipate how defenders would react, and to exploit every structural weakness. The psychological impact on Hoshino's men was profound. Soldiers who had once stood steadfast in reinforced bunkers now hesitated at every noise, flinched at the whistling approach of a rocket, and constantly scanned for the telltale silhouette of a bazooka operator. Morale faltered in the face of a weapon that seemed to strike without warning from distances previously considered safe. Even as defenses were modified, the Americans continued to innovate. Some troops began using small hills, ridges, and abandoned vehicles as makeshift firing platforms, allowing them to strike over cover without exposing themselves fully. Others experimented with rapid-fire techniques. One soldier would distract the enemy with rifle fire while another lined up the rocket, squeezing off 2 or 3 shots in quick succession. By mid-morning, entire bunkers that had once seemed impregnable were being neutralized in a matter of minutes. By nightfall, both sides were exhausted but enlightened. Hoshino and his officers understood that conventional strategies were insufficient against this new technology. American soldiers, bruised and fatigued, realized that mastery over the bazooka was not simply about firing, it was about coordination, creativity, and understanding the enemy's psychology. The first true test of adaptation was complete, but the war was far from over. For the Japanese defenders, the lesson was humbling. Even the strongest fortification could fall to ingenuity and audacity. For the Americans, the bazooka had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of possibility, a way for the individual soldier to wield unprecedented influence on the battlefield. As the moon rose over the Mediterranean, smoke still curling from shattered walls, both sides knew one thing with certainty. The rules had changed, and survival would depend not just on courage, but on how quickly they could learn, improvise, and strike first. November 10th, 1942. Dawn broke over the scarred beaches of Oruran, turning the sea into a sheet of silver and the sand into a harsh, unrelenting canvas of shadows. The Americans were ready for the first major coordinated assault using the bazooka. Weeks of trial and error, observation, and quiet improvisation had led to this moment. A synchronized strike designed to dismantle the Japanese defenses that had so far seemed unassailable. Lieutenant Greene crouched behind a low ridge, his breath fogging in the crisp morning air. His bazooka team, Private McAllister and Corporal Reynolds, was in position, rifles slung, eyes scanning every bunker and pillbox dotting the horizon. Overhead, reconnaissance planes traced slow arcs, signaling movements to ground commanders. Every detail had been rehearsed: suppressive rifle fire, rocket targeting, coordinated infantry advancement. It was as close to a surgical strike as warfare could achieve. The first rocket fired with a sharp crack, the metal tube recoiling into Greene's shoulder. It hit the side of a concrete bunker, sending a plume of dust, splintered wood, and shattered masonry into the air. Japanese soldiers scrambled, disoriented, their defensive lines momentarily broken. Greene's team did not pause. One rocket after another struck the remaining strongpoints, each hit carefully calculated to collapse walls, destroy weapons emplacements, and force the defenders into open ground. On the other side, Colonel Hoshino barked orders, desperately attempting to plug gaps and rally his men. Machine gunners repositioned, snipers sought new vantage points, and reserve troops ran from cover to cover. Yet even the most seasoned soldiers were faltering. The bazooka allowed the Americans to neutralize bunkers that would have taken hours to reduce with conventional artillery. What had once been a strong defensive line now resembled a shattered mosaic, each broken piece leaving the defenders more vulnerable. The infantry followed quickly. Riflemen moved behind smoke screens, exploiting the temporary chaos. Each American soldier had learned to anticipate how Japanese troops would react under bazooka fire. Crouch, pivot, retreat, expose themselves. Mortars dropped shells into collapsing positions, and grenades finished what rockets began. It was a dance of destruction, precise, coordinated, and terrifyingly effective. For the Japanese, the psychological toll was immense. Soldiers who had trained for years in the art of static defense now faced an enemy that struck with deadly speed from unexpected angles, and with weapons capable of punching through walls as easily as wood or brick. Hoshino's own eyes, scanning the battlefield, reflected both admiration for the Americans' ingenuity and a dawning fear for the futility of his current tactics. By midday, the first line of bunkers had been neutralized. American troops pressed forward, emboldened by the efficiency of their weapons and the sight of previously immovable defenses crumbling under rocket fire. Bazooka teams leaped from cover to cover, rockets firing in rapid succession, each impact driving the enemy further back. The battlefield was chaotic, loud, and filled with a tense rhythm. Fire, collapse, advance, repeat. As evening fell, both sides paused to assess the damage. The Americans had achieved what had seemed impossible, a coordinated assault that maximized the bazooka's potential while minimizing casualties. For the Japanese, the lesson was stark. Adaptability alone could not counter innovation without preparation, mobility, and new defensive thinking. In the smoldering twilight, the battlefield whispered a new truth. The war was no longer just a contest of numbers or fortifications. It was now a contest of ingenuity, speed, and daring. The age of the individual soldier wielding a weapon capable of rewriting the rules had truly begun. November 11th, 1942. The morning fog still clung to Oruran's battered coastline, masking the aftermath of the previous day's assault. The Americans, flush with the success of their bazooka strike, had fortified their positions, repaired minor damage, and readied for the inevitable counterattack. Even as they celebrated their tactical ingenuity, they knew that the Japanese would not remain idle. Colonel Hoshino had spent the night pacing the remains of his command post. The destruction of the first defensive line was not just a physical loss, it was a psychological blow. Yet in defeat, he found a spark of determination. Orders were sent to secondary fortifications inland, trenches deepened, and machine gun positions relocated to unexpected angles. Small groups of soldiers were instructed in rapid mobility drills, learning to ambush, fall back, and disappear before the Americans could target them effectively. By mid-morning, the first waves of Japanese counterattacks began. Unlike the previous day, they avoided static bunkers and predictable positions. Instead, they used the terrain with precision. Ridges, ruined buildings, and dense clusters of vegetation became their shields. Snipers found new vantage points, hidden until the right moment. Machine guns were emplaced in overlapping arcs of fire, and improvised explosives slowed the American advance. Lieutenant Greene noticed the difference immediately. The previous day, rockets had flown unobstructed toward their targets. Now, the enemy was adapting, dispersing, and striking back with sudden, unpredictable force. Greene's team huddled behind a low stone wall, firing cautiously. Each shot required careful calculation. Misfires could expose their position and invite lethal retaliation. The Americans' mobility proved crucial. Small, coordinated squads moved from cover to cover, keeping pressure on Japanese forces while minimizing exposure. Yet, even with the bazooka, the cost of progress had increased. Casualties were mounting, and morale, once buoyed by early success, was tempered by the realization that the enemy had learned quickly. Amid the chaos, a quiet respect emerged on both sides. Japanese soldiers marveled at the bazooka's destructive power, while American troops were forced to recognize the ingenuity and adaptability of their adversary. Every destroyed bunker and every thwarted advance became a lesson, a small insight into the evolving face of modern warfare. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By nightfall, the Americans had retained most of their gains, but the landscape of combat had shifted. The Japanese had not been defeated, they had adapted. New defensive lines were already forming, designed to exploit the limitations of the bazooka and the predictability of American movements. Both sides understood that the next day would demand even greater cunning, speed, and audacity. In the dim glow of campfires, soldiers on both sides reflected on the brutal efficiency of modern war. For the Americans, the bazooka had proven itself, but its power alone was not enough to guarantee victory. For the Japanese, each loss was a lesson in innovation, resilience, and the relentless requirement to evolve. Oruran had become more than a battlefield. It was a proving ground. The war was no longer a test of numbers, it was a contest of adaptation, anticipation, and courage. And as the night deepened, every soldier, whether firing or fleeing, knew that tomorrow would be another crucible in which only the sharpest, fastest, and most daring would survive. November 12th, 1942. Dawn arrived over Oruran like a muted warning, the pale light revealing the scars of the previous day's battles. The air smelled of smoke, oil, and earth, upturned by relentless artillery fire. For both sides, the morning brought no comfort, only the knowledge that this day could decide the course of the battle. Colonel Hoshino surveyed his men from a ridge, his sharp eyes tracing the American positions below. He knew the enemy would strike again, likely in waves designed to test every weakness. Yet he also understood the advantage of defense. Oruran's ridges, ruined structures, and hidden gullies could be leveraged to devastating effect. Orders were shouted, quickly absorbed, and executed with precision honed by days of relentless adaptation. American troops, led by Lieutenant Greene, were equally alert. The bazooka had proven effective, but its successes had also revealed vulnerabilities. Greene coordinated reconnaissance squads, moved his squads along less predictable routes, and laid suppressive fire to keep Japanese forces off balance. Every movement was measured, every choice a gamble in the deadly game unfolding across the hills and trenches. The first assault began mid-morning. Japanese snipers opened fire, from concealed positions, picking off soldiers who strayed too far from cover. Artillery shells screamed overhead, shaking the ground and filling the air with dust and debris. American squads countered, using the bazooka to demolish barricades and neutralize machine gun nests, but the defenders were clever, constantly relocating and exploiting terrain. Hours passed in a relentless, shifting struggle. One moment, Americans pressed forward, capturing a bunker. The next, Japanese counterattacks reclaimed it, leaving both sides battered but unbroken. Greene noted the enemy's ingenuity, particularly their use of decoys and feigned retreats, forcing his men to constantly reassess every advance. Amid the chaos, individual acts of courage punctuated the battle. A young American soldier, separated from his unit, crawled through mud and debris to disable a hidden machine gun emplacement, saving an entire squad. On the Japanese side, a squad leader led a daring night raid, collapsing an American trench with precision explosives before disappearing into the darkness. These moments, brief and violent, underscored the human cost of war, the courage that often determined survival. By evening, Oruran's landscape had been reshaped once again. Trenches were deeper, rubble fields expanded, and smoke hung over the battlefield like a shroud. Both sides bore heavy casualties, but neither had yielded. The Americans retained some territory, yet the Japanese had proven their resilience, adapting to every tactic thrown at them. As twilight fell, the soldiers rested uneasily. The night would be short, for both sides knew the final crucible was approaching. Oruran had become more than a battlefield. It was a test of endurance, ingenuity, and psychological fortitude. Every movement, every decision, could tip the balance between survival and annihilation. Lieutenant Greene and Colonel Hoshino, separated by hundreds of meters but united in the same relentless struggle, both understood the kami, unspoken truth. The coming day would demand everything they had learned, and possibly more. Oruran's outcome hung in the balance, waiting for the decisive moment that would crown one side victorious or condemn both to futility. November 13th, 1942. The sky over Oruran was a cold grey, the sun struggling to pierce a veil of smoke and dust. The battlefield had become a patchwork of trenches, shattered buildings, and scorched earth. Every surviving soldier carried the weight of exhaustion, hunger, and the constant hum of tension, yet neither side would yield. Lieutenant Greene crouched behind a crater, binoculars in hand. He watched Japanese patrols moving cautiously along ridges, aware that a counter-offensive was imminent. His own men, battered but determined, had learned to anticipate traps, relying on improvisation and instinct honed over days of brutal engagement. Greene's mind raced through strategies, weighing risks and calculating timing. Victory or survival demanded more than courage. It required precision. At first light, the Japanese launched their most daring maneuver yet. Using smoke screens and stealth, small squads infiltrated American lines, targeting supply caches and communications posts. Confusion rippled through Greene's men. The initial shock was severe, but the Americans adapted quickly. Using flares to illuminate darkened trenches, they coordinated a counterattack, employing both suppressive fire and strategically placed explosives. The clash escalated into a chaotic symphony of sound. Gunfire rattled in bursts, grenades detonated with deafening force, and artillery shook the ground as if the earth itself groaned under the weight of conflict. Soldiers on both sides moved like ghosts, sometimes disappearing into rubble only to reappear moments later, testing every ounce of nerve and focus. Amid the maelstrom, decisive actions began to shift the balance. Lieutenant Greene, recognizing a critical gap in the Japanese lines, led a small, flanking squad through a narrow ravine. The maneuver was fraught with danger. One misstep would be fatal, but it exploited the enemy's overextension, collapsing a key defensive position. The Americans surged forward, reclaiming lost ground and turning panic into momentum. Colonel Hoshino, sensing the change, rallied his remaining forces with urgency. Counterattacks were launched with ferocity, but fatigue and dwindling supplies weakened their effectiveness. Each assault was met with coordinated resistance, and the tactical advantage increasingly favored the Americans. Hoshino realized that Oruran's defense might hold only so long. Adaptability had its limits. By late afternoon, the battlefield was littered with the debris of combat, destroyed bunkers, shattered equipment, and exhausted soldiers. The Americans had gained a foothold in positions previously thought impregnable, while the Japanese, though still resolute, were forced into a defensive posture. The momentum had shifted, the tide of battle had turned. As night fell, silence descended, broken only by distant fires and the occasional echo of artillery. Soldiers huddled wherever they could, physically spent but aware that the next day could still decide everything. Lieutenant Greene, surveying the transformed landscape, felt the weight of responsibility pressing down. Every life lost had been measured, every gain hard-earned. Oruran, scarred and relentless, had tested the limits of human endurance. In this crucible, courage alone was insufficient. Strategy, adaptability, and the ability to seize fleeting opportunities determined the line between triumph and catastrophe. The battle was far from over, but one undeniable truth had emerged. The Americans had claimed the momentum, and the next chapter would define whether that momentum could be turned into final victory. November 14th, 1942. Dawn broke over Oruran like a reluctant witness, casting pale light over a battlefield that had been transformed into a grim tableau of destruction and endurance. Smoke still curled from shattered buildings, trenches were waterlogged and strewn with the detritus of combat, and the scent of spent gunpowder hung thick in the air. The Americans, now entrenched in positions once dominated by the Japanese, moved cautiously, aware that victory had been hard won, but not yet complete. Lieutenant Greene stood atop a ridge, surveying the devastated landscape. His men were weary beyond measure, their faces etched with dirt, sweat, and the lingering shadows of fear. Some limped, their uniforms torn and blood-streaked. Others sat silently, staring at nothing, attempting to reconcile the ferocity they had just endured with the tenuous reality that they had survived. Greene himself felt the weight of command like never before. Every order, every decision had been a delicate balance between aggression and preservation, and he knew that countless lives had hung in the balance. The aftermath of the previous day's fighting revealed the human cost. Bodies lay scattered across the fields, some fallen where they had fought, others dragged into hastily dug graves by exhausted comrades. Both sides bore scars not just in the wreckage of war machines and fortifications, but in the minds and spirits of those who remained. Among Greene's men, there was a grim acknowledgement that survival had often depended on sheer chance, a single misstep potentially determining life or death. Colonel Hoshino moved among his troops, his own exhaustion evident beneath the stoic mask he maintained. The Japanese forces, though resilient, had been forced to cede ground they had once held with such confidence. The meticulous coordination, disciplined formations, and bravery that had defined Hoshino's defense had been eroded by relentless counterattacks, fatigue, and logistical limitations. He recognized with an almost haunting clarity that the tide had shifted irrevocably. Victory was no longer a distant goal, but a fragile illusion slipping further from reach. Yet, even amid the wreckage, moments of humanity emerged. American medics moved tirelessly through the battlefield, administering aid to both friend and foe, navigating the dangerous terrain with grim determination. Greene watched as Corporal Jenkins, a young soldier barely 20, carried a wounded Japanese infantryman to a makeshift triage area. In those quiet acts, the stark reality of war's moral complexity revealed itself. Enemies were not faceless. They were individuals caught in the same unforgiving crucible. The war demanded brutality, yet the human instinct for compassion persisted, fragile but unyielding. Communication lines were re-established slowly, as radio operators and signal teams repaired damaged equipment. Reports flowed in from scattered squads, detailing pockets of resistance, lost supply caches, and enemy withdrawal movements. Greene and his command staff pieced together the emerging picture. The Japanese were retreating strategically, not out of despair, but to consolidate forces and prevent total annihilation. This subtle shift marked the end of the immediate confrontation, yet it heralded new challenges. Occupying and holding Oruran would require sustained vigilance, careful planning, and unrelenting resilience. By mid-afternoon, the Americans had begun fortifying newly acquired positions. Trenches were deepened, barricades reinforced, and artillery placements recalibrated. Engineers worked to clear fields of unexploded ordnance, aware that a single mistake could undo the hard-won gains of the previous 2 days. Soldiers patrolled cautiously, every shadow a potential threat, every distant noise a reminder that war never truly paused. Greene moved among them, offering words of encouragement, trying to instill calm where only exhaustion and anxiety remained. Leadership in such moments was as much about presence as strategy. Morale could be the deciding factor between holding Oruran and losing it again. Night fell slowly, bringing with it a fragile quiet. The stars above seemed indifferent to the human suffering below, yet they also offered a silent witness to the perseverance displayed. Around small fires, soldiers wrote letters, shared sparse meals, and whispered memories of home, clinging to fragments of normalcy in a world upended by conflict. Greene found a moment of solitude near the edge of the ridge, reflecting on the battle's arc from the initial chaos to the decisive maneuvers that had turned momentum in their favor. The memory of those lost, the weight of responsibility, and the fragile hope of survival intertwined in a tapestry of complex emotion. In the distance, the last remnants of Hoshino's forces slipped away into forests and hills, leaving Oruran under American control. Greene knew this occupation was temporary in the grand theatre of war, but it was a milestone, a tangible, hard-fought achievement that demonstrated the interplay of courage, strategy, and adaptability. The battle had revealed stark truths. Individual bravery mattered, but so did coordination. Instinct could save a life, but preparation often decided the outcome. The lessons learned on Oruran would resonate far beyond its scarred fields, influencing tactics, command decisions, and the mindset of soldiers yet to face similar crucibles. As the night deepened, the battlefield lay in a fragile suspension between past violence and uncertain future. Fires smoldered, patrols continued their watch, and the soldiers who had survived reflected quietly on their ordeal. Lieutenant Greene, standing atop the ridge, understood that history would not remember every sacrifice, every moment of fear and heroism, but for those who had lived it, the memory was indelible. Oruran had tested them in every conceivable way, stripping life to its essentials, survival, duty, and the fleeting glimpses of humanity amid chaos. And in that quiet, as the wind whispered through the ruined landscape, one truth stood clear. War could destroy, but it could also reveal. It revealed courage under fire, compassion amid carnage, and the stark limits and boundless capacities of the human spirit. Oruran was scarred, its people and soldiers forever changed, yet it was also a testament to resilience. The battle was over, but its echoes, the lessons, the losses, the victories would endure, shaping those who survived, and the history they would carry forward. Lieutenant Greene turned from the ridge, descending toward his weary men. The first light of dawn on the horizon promised another day, another challenge, but also a moment to reflect, to honor, and to prepare. Oruran had been a crucible, and from it, something vital had emerged, the understanding that even in war, the human spirit could endure, adapt, and prevail. The days that followed were quieter, but not peaceful. Oruran, now under American control, was a landscape of contradictions, fields of shattered homes and trenches, contrasted with cautious human perseverance. Soldiers moved through the town like shadows, tending to the wounded, clearing debris, and rebuilding what could be salvaged. Every step was a reminder of the battle just past, yet also of the fragile hope that survival allowed. Greene walked among his men with measured steps, observing, listening, and sometimes simply standing silent as they shared the weight of recent memories. He noticed how the human spirit revealed itself in small ways. Private Morales had found a stray puppy among the rubble and brought it to the aid station, where it immediately became a companion to both injured soldiers and weary medics. The animal's presence reminded them of life beyond the battlefield, a fleeting connection to normalcy that persisted even amid devastation. In another corner, Corporal Jenkins was teaching a group of local children to draw, using scraps of paper and charred pencils scavenged from ruined houses. Amid the wreckage, human resilience manifested in the simplest acts: care, creativity, and compassion. Yet there was also reckoning. The soldiers who had survived carried scars that no medicine could heal. Many found sleep elusive, haunted by the sudden violence, the cries of comrades, and the fleeting glimpses of humanity extinguished too soon. Greene observed these silent struggles and understood that leadership extended beyond strategy. It was about recognizing the psychological toll of combat and fostering a fragile sense of community. He organized small circles where men could speak of what they had seen, what they feared, and what they hoped for, offering them a space to confront memories that might otherwise consume them. Meanwhile, letters began to arrive, official dispatches, personal messages from home, and reports from other units. They reminded the men that Oruran was only a chapter in a much larger war. While the battle had been significant, it was part of an unrelenting sequence of campaigns and strategies that stretched across continents. Greene understood that victory here was temporary, fragile, yet it also carried symbolic weight. It proved that discipline, courage, and adaptability could turn the tide even against a well-entrenched enemy. Colonel Hoshino, meanwhile, had withdrawn to reorganize his forces. Intelligence reports indicated that his retreat was methodical rather than panicked, aimed at conserving his troops for future engagements. Greene considered this carefully. The Japanese commander had shown remarkable resilience, and Greene respected the discipline and ingenuity that had allowed Hoshino's men to resist as long as they had. The confrontation at Oruran was not merely a story of victory and defeat. It was a study in strategy, endurance, and the delicate interplay between leadership, morale, and human limitation. In the evenings, Greene often walked the ridges alone, reflecting on what had transpired. He revisited every decision, every movement, every split-second choice that had determined the outcome, and as he looked across the scarred landscape, he realized that history was rarely as simple as it appeared in hindsight. The bravery of soldiers, the strategic cunning of commanders, the element of chance all converged to create moments of triumph and tragedy. The battlefield was a mirror of humanity itself, flawed, courageous, fragile, and resilient. Weeks later, as the initial occupation solidified, Greene oversaw the construction of memorials for those who had fallen. Both American and Japanese soldiers were remembered, not as enemies, but as human beings caught in a conflict far larger than themselves. These memorials became sites of quiet reflection, places where survivors could acknowledge loss while contemplating endurance. Greene understood that remembrance was essential. It honored sacrifice, but it also ensured that lessons endured, shaping future soldiers, commanders, and civilians alike. Oruran began to breathe again, slowly. Farmers returned to tilled fields, children cautiously played among partially rebuilt homes, and townspeople rebuilt their lives one brick at a time. The war, relentless and unforgiving, continued elsewhere, but here life persisted. Greene found a sense of closure not in conquest, but in witnessing the persistence of life and spirit amid destruction. The battle had ended, but the human story, the true legacy of Oruran, continued. In his final report, Greene wrote not only of tactical outcomes but of human resilience, of courage, fear, and compassion, intertwined in every action. He noted the heroism of soldiers and civilians alike, the silent endurance of the wounded, and the fleeting, sacred moments of humanity that persisted even in a world scarred by war. Oruran had been a crucible that tested limits, revealed character, and forced choices that weighed heavily on the soul. Yet it had also affirmed the unyielding capacity of people to endure, to adapt, and to rebuild. As the sun set over Oruran, Greene stood once more on the ridge, looking out over the fields, trenches, and smouldering ruins that were slowly becoming history. He felt the weight of every life lost, every act of bravery, every quiet moment of compassion. And in that moment, he understood a profound truth. War may destroy, but it also exposes the very essence of humanity, the courage to act, the wisdom to endure, and the resilience to hope. Oruran was no longer just a battlefield. It had become a testament, a story of human endurance, of lessons learned at the edge of survival, and of the enduring power of the human spirit. Greene turned to descend, carrying with him the echoes of the past, the knowledge of what had been endured, and a quiet hope that those lessons would not be forgotten.